They came together to master an enticing new danger at a time when it was still acceptable to be in awe of all possibilities. The following regulations established by the United States Air Service will be adhered to. In case an engine fails on takeoff, land straight ahead, regardless of obstacles. Riding on the steps, wings, or tail of a machine is prohibited. No spins will be indulged in as they unnecessarily strain the machine. Passengers will only enter flying machines through the door. Hedge hopping or similar stunts will not be tolerated. The above government regulations do not necessarily apply to civilian aviators.
The early days of aviation on Long Island in New York. There hasn't been a period in history like it since. Ragtime, Dixieland, foot-tapping rhythms of the flapper era were everywhere. And Sunday tinkerers were everywhere, working on homemade versions of what the Wright brothers had first put together.
The object of this invention is to construct an aeroplane that will make an almost direct ascent.
It was the fabled 20s and 30s when the sight of a balloon or flying machine overhead still stirred visions of far-off places and magical expectations. Roosevelt and Curtis Fields, part of Long Island's wide Hempstead Plains, had become America's most forgiving runway. Pilots could take off and land in almost any direction. There was so much open space. It had room for mistakes. Guidelines about what would probably work in the air and what would likely get you killed in one of these wood, cloth, and metal barnstormers were still being written, one flight at a time. Eleanor Smith, then a high school sophomore from Freeport, Long Island, irrevocably drawn to the roar of ever more powerful engines on these treeless plains, would write in her memoir, Aviatrix, "We had no notion that we were watching history in the making. For all the uproar drew every promoter, con man, drifter, and fast buck artist like metal shavings to a magnet." She soloed at 15, broke both altitude and endurance records the following year, and at 19 was voted best woman pilot in the United States by her licensed pilot peers. Paul Rizzo was there too. He learned to fly in 2 weeks and became an instructor the next. He's still at it at 94. Tom Murphy, at 85, teaching aerobatics over Long Island in this Navy fighter trainer. He was there. Bill Schwenk saw it all. At 83, he's about to test fly this retooled World War I Jenny engine after he refits it to his rebuilt Pheasant H-10. At 85, former airline captain Herb Ottewill is still happiest when piloting his J-3 Cub cross-country. They and Len Klasmeyer, Rudy Klein, Pete Brucia, George Dade, Norm Duncan, Sig Aldert, Perry Duryea, Carl Alber, and Ed Harrington were there when Long Island was as one boundless airfield. This is their rich eyewitness account. This is the way they remember it.
My dad was bringing us back from Coney Island in a surrey with a fringe on top, a nice horse that he owned, and I heard this noise. And then I see this pusher biplane coming up off Brighton Beach with a man sitting up in front and controlling it with 2 sticks. And that really thrilled me. It made an awful racket. It didn't go very fast, but I could see his face, and he was looking down at this one. He flew over, and fortunately, we were still out in the open, and there weren't any trees around. I had a good look at this thing.
We lived up in the Bronx then, and I remember one day there was an airplane, which was very unusual then, and I'm watching it, and I don't know whether he did it purposely or what, but he spun it, you know. Oh, I was awestruck.
During a school recess, a blimp went over. Maybe I was 7 or 8 years old, and watching this thing go past, I just had to be up there somehow or other.
We used to take bicycles and ride from where I lived out to Roosevelt Field, and it was before Lindbergh. I remember seeing Lindbergh out there before he made his flight. Didn't know who he was then.
Hey, look out, will you?
I rode over to Curtis Field in Valley Stream on a bike. And when Frank Hawks came with Time Flies, when he set the transcontinental race and landed at Valley Stream. And I was looking through the fence, and he said, "Hey kid, if you got nothing to do, come on in here." And he, with a rag, and I was, first thing you know, I was chief mechanic in charge of wiping it off. And I was afraid to wash my hands because I had touched this great airplane,
Sig Aldert, one of aviation's most respected flight instructors, taught more than 1,000 people to fly. The marvel of flight, of flying, all began for him at Roosevelt Field.
The job was merely a helper in the hangar. I knew little or nothing about airplanes. I had to clean them. I learned how to start them by pulling the propeller. And being of my large stature, it got to be known around there that even from other hangars, if they had trouble starting an airplane, get Sig.
Pulling a prop that could kick back with the deadly force of a guillotine was considered pretty dangerous.
It was dangerous, yes. And then it was dangerous if you had absent-minded people walking around the field and walking into one, and that happened too. They were decapitated.
I walked to Roosevelt Field every day, sometimes kind of rough in winter. But I picked up a little flying time if you owned an airplane, and I shined it for you. Maybe you gave me 15 minutes dual or something, and maybe you only had a student permit. My pay, by the way, was $20 a week and a half-hour flying time.
My father found out that I was flying. He didn't know about it. And boy, he raved hell. He said, "You leave those damn things alone or out of the house you go." And then as an afterthought, he said, "Why don't you be like other kids and hang around the pool room?" You know, that's what they thought of pilots in those days.
The first flight itself I have never forgotten. That's how much of an impression it made on me. Because you sat in a bullet-shaped cockpit out in the front. It was a pusher type. And you could just, to see those fields in front of you, and of course all beautifully laid out because it was all farmland. And the shafts of sunlight coming down on it was so exquisite. Well, anyway, I was hooked. That was it. I never had any trouble finding myself. I always knew I wanted to do that.
I was nervous about the takeoff because I'd always feared the airplane nosing over. You know, in the early days, that was one of the problems. The fields were rutty, and frequently airplanes would just nose over and mostly just break the propeller.
Most of the time. Nevertheless, the kids would hang around doing odd jobs, just hoping to hear some pilot say, "Hey kid, you want to fly?"
I can remember just going around, and it was like going to heaven, I guess, for me, because I always looked up at them and saw them landing and worked on them, and here I'm finally getting into one to see what it is. And it surprises the dickens out of you. And especially at night, the first night flight, when you see the flames coming out of the exhaust, it scares the hell out of you. Because you don't know that them flames are coming out in the daylight because you can't see them. But when you see them coming out in the dark, oh boy, you know, we might be on fire.
The fumes coming from those exhaust stacks was sickening. I mean, we just had a little windshield in front of you. It didn't protect you.
The notion of taking off on an airborne adventure, of turning some wood, canvas, wire, and screws into a magic carpet, preoccupied many of Long Island's backyard tinkerers. It didn't always work out, of course.
A couple of kids that I knew, we were building this Heath parasaur. We never finished it, never got the money for the motor, you know. And we traded it in for a horse, but that was no good. The horse, whether you used him or not, he ate, you know, so he got rid of him.
Four of us got together. We bought an old gypsy moth. We paid $600 for it and fixed it up. We essentially taught ourselves how to fly. One fellow had a private license, and that lasted for a couple of months. Then we wrecked the airplane. That was the end of that. But that's what got me started.
What do you do when your flight instructor passes out while you're airborne and you haven't yet put any time in how to get back down? Ed Harrington, who completed his career as a captain and chief pilot for Eastern Airlines, found himself in command of a student flight at 13. His instructor had stopped off at Roy's Clam House on Long Island for a little something to drink.
But when he came back, he was in some shape. Wow, boy. So he put me in the back, and he pulled the prop through. It's a wonder he didn't fall into it. And he climbed into the front cockpit, and I took off from where we barnstormed. I had every bit of 2 hours then. And we flew back to Jamaica Sea Airport. Next thing I know, the door's open, and his feet's hanging out the side of it. But there's no head, because he's passed out. He's had it. So I'm flying around, and the sea fog is rolling in, and I said, well, you know how to land. What else are you going to do? He's out of the picture. So I backed off and came in over Rockaway Boulevard and landed. And finally, we got him to a little bit, and he said, how'd we get on the ground? I said, I landed. He said, well, so you're solo. And that was the way I soloed. I had about 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Incidentally, when you went solo in those days, somebody tie a scarf onto your strut, which was not only a mark of distinction, but it warned everybody that you had a real amateur and a real new boy flying the airplane.
Eleanor Smith had to report for her solo flight before she went to school.
First of all, I was scared silly because Russ hadn't told me I was going to solo that day. He just got out of the cockpit and said, go. And I didn't want him to. I had gotten used to him being there. But anyway, well, this is the way it is. I got to go. So I remember staring at the tachometer, and thinking, well, he's told me everything he knows, but what was in the back of my mind was, this is his airplane, and you got to bring it back in one piece. This is his living. And so I came around and landed, and he motioned me around again. I made 3 landings, and then it was time to go back to Wantagh because I had to go to school.
Ernie Marcus soloed me. Now that's a story that I'll never forget till the day I die. I thought I was ready to solo, you know, being a young hotshot, which we all think we are. And he always said, you're not going to solo till you make 3 perfect landings. That was the nature of the way we were taught to fly those days. And I landed, took off, landed, took off. And the 3rd time we taxied back, and he back. He's signaling me to go back further, and then turn around, so I turned. And next thing he was getting out. I said, where the hell are you going? He said, you've been hollering to Solo, now I'm gonna let you go. And I was so good, as I thought, that I didn't even know I made three-point landings. Had to be three, tail skid and the wheels. And then I soloed in a drizzly day. But we got back to the airport, and I went home doing 90 miles an hour on my feet, running to tell my mother that I soloed. And hell, I was about 17, I guess, 16, 17. So that's, 60 years ago. I still fly.
It wasn't long after that Pete Brucia bought his own plane.
It cost me 22 cars. Now, we're talking the Depression days, which when you talk today to people, they think you just came out of Creedmoor or I should be in Central Islip. Used to go to the junkie, pay $1 or $2 for a car. Never paid more than $3.50 or $4, and sell it for $20 or $25. And at the end of the year, I had enough to buy the airplane. With $500.
Paul Rizzo soloed without any experience in a cockpit at all.
Paul never had any instruction. He just taught himself. And I don't think he's ever scratched an airplane. I don't know of it.
I just jumped in the plane and soloed it. I never had any hours. I read in a book how to fly an airplane, and in following those instructions, I did exactly what the book said.
I flew the airplane all day long, taking off from land and making turns, doing everything with it. And when I decided, well, I'm pretty good at flying at level, how do you spin this plane? I already read the book, but I got a hold of one of the pilots. How do you spin a plane? So he told me. So I went up several thousand feet, put it into a stall, and did exactly as the book had stated. Came down and sure enough went into a spin.
And I found out the most important thing in a spin. When you're spinning, you must stop the turn first, then come back with the stick and pull it back. If you attempt to pull the stick back in its spin while you're still turning, you'll go right down to the ground. It will not come out of a spin
until you stop the rotation first, then come back with the stick. After 2 weeks, I start giving instructions.
Paul was an excellent pilot.
Taught himself how to fly with a book in one hand, the control stick in the other. And all the while, his parents knew nothing about it until somebody let the cat out of the bag.
And the way they found out was a student of mine by the name of Charlie Moore, who lived in Canarsie, came over the house on a Saturday and told either my father or mother, I forgot, tell Paul I will not be taking my flying lessons this weekend. And my father didn't know what he's talking about. Flying lessons, what do you mean? Well, Paul is teaching me to fly. So when my father found out I had an airplane, he said, all right, son, he says, I want you to do me a favor. I says, what? He says, I want you to drop 5 pounds of frankfurters in back of Mrs. Olson's house, right behind the kitchen window, if possible. The reason for that was that Mrs. Olson never passed my father's frankfurter stand, regardless of the hours, without buying a 5-cent all-beef frankfurter. As it states on that picture there, frankfurters 5 cents, Horton's ice cream 5 cents. So I took the 5 pounds of frankfurters, took them out to Curtis Field, put them in my Jenny, went over Canarsie flying low and slow, and I got over the house and then dropped the frankfurters right behind Mrs. Olson's kitchen window. You can't do that today.
Now within gliding range of the field.
Whoever taught you to fly, that's the way you flew.
I'm gliding towards the field, towards my spot. I'm gradually losing altitude.
Now, you never made a turn unless you put the nose down. So, consequently, as you make a turn, as you increase the bank, the stalling speed of the airplane goes up. So you're reaching a stalling speed. So if you put the nose down, you're not going to reach that stalling speed and fall out of the sky. You got to remember, or you don't remember, or you don't know, but airplane accidents were common. Common as hell. Look at all the airplanes that were built in this country by the pioneers that killed themselves because they didn't know how to fly them. They built them, then they couldn't fly them, and they take off and bang, right?
The way to survive was to practice. Eleanor couldn't understand why pilots would get bored with that.
I could fly 5 or 6 hours at a clip and do nothing but come in and practice landings. And because I was just shooting at a target, I wanted to be sure I knew what I was doing. I wanted to know what every single inch of wing space would do. And it was the only way to learn it. And you had to do it by yourself. And so I was just in seventh heaven.
Women in general weren't supposed to be in that kind of seventh heaven. They were supposed to be in the kitchen, or working as secretaries or seamstresses. There were women who didn't agree.
Brunette versus blonde Daredevil. Dark-haired Yuba Kimmey matches nerve with Alice Gibson in a contest for a parachute jumping job.
The wager? Which one of these two parachutists would be the most accurate?
It's in the bag.
Going down, never even hesitated. Blondie's right on her heels. It's a 2,000-foot drop to solid earth. Away they sail. They're aiming for a marker placed on the field. The girl who lands nearest cops the paycheck. Miss Brunette wins. She landed only a few feet from the goal. And P.S., she got the job.
Well, I told you I had it in the bag, and I won.
Anything to do with flying had become hot news. It captured the headlines most weekdays and captivated thousands at Roosevelt Field on Sundays.
They put the air show on to bring the people out. It was just so that people could come out and see these airplanes. Some people had never seen one.
Well, they were simply wonderful. The names were there, the people were there, the different aircraft, the parachute jumping.
I'm going up and make a triple parachute jump.
Watch closely and you'll see him leave for the long drop. He's off. Now you can see how it feels. Wouldn't that make you dizzy? Now keep your eye on Joe, because he's going to cut the rope. There he goes. He drops 300 feet more and then opens a second parachute. What a thrill and what on earth. Number 3. And down he goes for the final drop. He must have trained for this on some of those skyscraper elevators. Well, he certainly earned his salary today. And after that, it's just a joyride for Joe. But he has to look out that he doesn't do a Santa Claus act and land in somebody's chimney. Joe risked his life today to show that it's possible to carry extra parachutes, so that if one fails to open, you still have a couple more. Just like carrying a couple of spare tires.
This girl come over from Germany with a small plane and a mechanic. And her name was Fräulein Thea Rasch, and she could stand still in the air if she got enough headwind. And she used to do that right over the field. She's a big blonde dame, so I enjoyed that. I can't remember the name of the plane. It was a little sport job.
Also arriving from Europe to dumbfound his audiences and his American flying colleagues was German air ace Ernst Udet.
He used this little biplane and was doing things like picking up handkerchiefs with his wingtips, and/or he'd have a hook on his fin, and the inverted pickup would be done with the tail low and then climbing out inverted and rolling back up. So it appeared as if it looked more as if he were doing it with mirrors, because you look at this airplane, little 7-cylinder engine, doing these maneuvers, and it didn't seem as if there was such a thing as flying speed. It just didn't seem to need anything, as if you'd steer a balloon around here and there.
Early on, a man out on the end of the wing transferring to another airplane was an exciting thing to see, because he'd get out, and once he got out the end of that wing, the airplane wasn't in balance anymore, and the pilot had to be ready to pull that wing up, and he'd get the other one right under it. It's really quite a dangerous thing, but I never saw anybody that missed, although they have them all over the country.
The only one that really put an air show on every Sunday at Roosevelt Field was Al Williams. He had a Curtiss Hawk, and he had a English Bliss Jupiter engine in it. And there was nobody could fly with the smoothness of Al Williams. I thought he was the greatest. I don't think there was any airport that I have ever been that will ever be the equal of Roosevelt Field, because the number of airplanes that were there, and the activity was there, and the type of individual that flew there, they were above the average. You could see it.
But Sundays, everybody went for a ride. Not everybody. I would use the word everybody. And to set the record straight, you never saw our car on a Sunday with 1 or 2 people in it. When it went, it was full of people. There weren't too many cars. Everybody didn't have a car. So when they went someplace, and they always had them little boxes or little chairs between the front seat and the back seat for the kids. And a trunk on the back or a thing tied on the side, and they went to the beach, and they would, if there was an airport, they all went to the airport and maybe bought a ride if they had the money. They had a scale there. It was a penny a pound then for quite a while. And you get on the scale, if you weighed 110 pounds, you paid $1.10. And some of the kids' job was to put their foot on the scale when nobody was looking. That way the pilot got a little bit more for the airplane.
And the people came down there, the airplane's right there. Well, you want to fly? Well, I don't know. Well, come on, take a look. And you show me the airplane like you show them a car today. And, of course, that was just salesmanship.
Finally, they get interested and want to go for a ride. And they had these blockers. They got this guy had a brand new airplane, and the blockers were saying, ride in the newest airplane on the field. And the other guy said, it's the newest airplane and the newest pilot. You know, they were trying.
Guy come along with a buck and he wanted to go for an airplane ride. So we go down Rockaway Boulevard, further down to the west. And gasoline at that time was 11 gallons for 88 cents. The guy at the airport was 8 or 9 for $1. There was a gas station on the airport property. But down there we got 11 gallons. So you put 2 5-gallon cans in the car, a gallon in the tank, and still had 12 cents change to stop and get the White Castle 2 hamburgers. And off we'd go and give them a ride. And then, you know, a short ride and save some gas for ourselves. And then we'd fly around till it quit. When it quit, glide in and land and wait until you get some more money.
It was always desirable to make sure they didn't get sick, because the routine was that the pilot that got his airplane messed up had to clean it himself, and I happily never had a passenger sick back in those days. Maybe on the airline I did, but not flying out of Roosevelt Field.
We did a terrific business there until the crash.
Then when the crash came, things changed. But we were busy all day long. On a weekend, I'd come home with $300 if the weather was good. If the weather was bad, not a penny. So the wife didn't know whether to spend money or not until I came home. I never counted the dollar bills. I just counted the $5 bills and the tens and shoved them under the rug, and that was it.
As engines became more powerful and questionable design departures were introduced, the human toll on Long Island began to rise. There was the streamlined Bonnie Gull with hydraulically flappable wings.
Well, one day the time came for its takeoff, and I was standing on the southwest corner of the field. Bonnie took off and towards us, and he got up about 50 feet, just over the edge of the field itself. The nose dropped a little bit, it came up, and then went straight in, full power on. And of course, that was a very impressionable calamity for me as a boy.
Well, every weekend, one or two airplanes would spin in, you know. They kept the Daily News busy on the front page, I can guarantee you that. But there were all kinds of aircraft accidents, at least 4 or 5 a week.
There are all kinds of hangers on and people wandering around waiting to see the crack-ups.
We had one girl they called Mabel Bowl. She was not a pilot, didn't even take instructions, but she walked around with helmet and goggles. Mabel Bowl, the Diamond Queen. And they took pictures of her in front of the airplane and sitting on a wing and all that. Never a pilot.
But the honest-to-God pilots, they just had to get up there and they wanted to be in the air. And in a force that said, go fly. It's difficult to describe the feeling, but it's pretty powerful stuff.
Some not only had to get up there, but way out there as well, over the water, where there was money to be made flying booze back to the mainland. Prohibition had shut off the supply of imbibable spirits. The seaplane came to the rescue.
One fellow had a small plane and he experimented, and he could carry 11 cases of liquor, and it was $5 a case for a 20-minute hop. That was pretty good money. Then later on, another fellow had a larger plane, a twin-engine plane that carried 45 cases. So things were pretty good there for a while. And I remember on several occasions, Vanny Higgins and little Augie Pisano, these are names that were in the papers, would hire me to fly out in the ocean 10, 15 miles, and I knew what they were going out there for when they had their field glasses. And the irony of the whole thing was that these gunboats were homing in on the Coast Guard station in Staten Island, so they knew where they were. The police didn't do nothing. In fact, the police would take the pilot home to the house.
The men and their flying machines, fearless, jaunty, heroes to the young women of their day, despite the fact that the women of that day were flying right alongside the men of that day. Tom Murphy.
There was quite a few girls there at the time. There was Helen Ritchie there, and there was Viola Gentry, she was there. And they kept the clique to themselves, and of course, Amelia Earhart was there, but they were a little bit on the snooty side, if you really want to know the truth.
The next event will be...
Eleanor Smith was the outstanding female pilot in the area. Her dad had been an actor on Broadway, and she was a very likable young lady and was well-liked by all the press.
The press gathered round the day she arrived to challenge the endurance record. She had just one worry. What if, for some reason, she had to find her way down at night, something she hadn't done before?
Hello, everybody. everybody. Just taking off on an attempted endurance half to crack the women's present standing solo endurance record, which is about 12 hours and 11 minutes, I understand, and held by a very plucky young lady on the West Coast. So if the cold doesn't get the better of me, the temperature today is 18 above zero. If the cold doesn't get the better of me, I'm afraid I'll stay up there till the wings fall off or something else happens.
It was the worst flight of my life, I can say that flatly. I was being bounced around up there and absolutely frozen stiff. In fact, the hot coffee in the vacuum bottles was frozen when I got back. So about 2 o'clock in the morning, I knew I couldn't handle it much longer because I had loosened the belt. My circulation was stopping. Now, in the meantime, I'm praying I can get down because I had never landed at night. I didn't plan to land at night.
A young pilot about to leave on an experimental blind flight between New York and Philadelphia heard about Eleanor still being up there. My God, he said, she'll freeze to death. The command at the field had become worried. We don't know how to get her down or what to do.
Well, this was going to be the test. And just then I saw a biplane come in under me, and there were 2 big ice puddles on Mitchell Field. And I saw this plane come in, circle twice under me, and then go straight between the 2 puddles. Well, that's all I needed to know. So then I stuck the nose down, stood on the rudder pedals, shot the very pistol off, and then I thought I'd set the airplane on fire because the thing, it showed the whole sky. And he gave me such a perfect pattern that I just went in after him. Well, it turns out that my savior was none other than my mentor, Jimmy Doolittle, and whom I hadn't met, but had just adored from afar.
It was Eleanor Smith's first endurance record, 13.5 hours in numbing cold.
I'm very tired and I like to go home now to get some sleep.
I want to congratulate you. Yeah. I think you're the best flyer of the women there is in the world.
Oh, thank you.
About 6 weeks after I set this solo endurance record at 13.5 hours, Bobby Trout broke it at I think she set it at 14.5, something like that. She just barely. But the thing was, it's broken. And once, it's just like anything else. Number 2 is not number 1. So I wanted to set it at 36 hours.
Eleanor contacted Giuseppe Balanca, designer of the finest cabin airplane of the time. It was big enough to carry the fuel she would need to remain aloft for a day and a half. After checking her ability to handle the huge aircraft, Balanca agreed to back her flight. She would be carrying as much gas as Lindbergh did to cross the Atlantic.
It was all under a blanket of secrecy, of course, because we didn't want anybody to know what this was all about. Except that I got news that Louise Satan, flying one of Walter Beech's new aircraft, the Travel Air, had pumped the record up to 22 hours. Well, now I've really got something to shoot at.
Hello, everybody. I'm just taking off in an attempt to shatter the world's endurance record for women, which at present stands at 22 hours. The Balanca's a very wonderful ship, and I think everything sounds good. The weather is fine, and if I hold out, I guess there isn't anything to stop it. I thank you.
Anyway, I brought the ship into New York, and it was a sensation. The fact that a girl was flying the Balanca, because nobody knew the Balanca except for Lindbergh. And then I went up and set the record.
April 24th, 1929. The Yankees and Robins were winners that day, and Eleanor beat Louise Thaden's mark by 4.5 hours. She was prepared to stay up longer, but her rudder cable fouled, forcing her to return to the field. Breaking the altitude record was next. At 26,000 feet, directly above the Chrysler Building in New York, her oxygen tube slipped from her mouth and she passed out. She came to above the Hempstead Reservoir. With no chance of getting back to Curtis Field, she set her sights on Mitchell.
So there was one place that I saw I could get down, but there were two trees like sentinels. I could get down, but I'd have to go through and pull the wings off. So I thought, well, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to take this ship up again. So I side-slipped into this place, stood on the brakes, turned it over. So, but there's a very smart photographer. He came over and waited until the block and tackle showed up, and when they pulled it up, you know, this way, on its tail with the nose in, that's the picture they printed, as though I had come down 26,000 feet to land on the nose, which, of course, there wouldn't have been anything left of if I had done that.
A year later, she extended the altitude record to 27,418 feet. And a year after that, broke through 34,000 feet. The boldest aviator of all was Bert Acosta, possibly the greatest natural flyer then or since.
Bert Acosta was good, but crazy. He was crazy as a loon, you know. He flew this Fokker Universal out there. He'd take off and he'd doing vertical banks right off the ground. And he hit the wing, busted the hell out of it. Nobody got killed.
And he would always take off the chandelle. Very, very spectacular looking takeoff. And I presume a very dangerous.
And then Bert Acosta would go to Mitchell Field and get a Curtiss Falcon. The Curtiss Falcon with the 12-cylinder engine in there. And he'd come and put an air show on. Drive everybody nuts.
Bert Acosta was perhaps the most gifted pilot that ever existed. He could simply do things with an airplane that weren't supposed to be. He was as hot a test pilot and as hot a pilot, and could fly any airplane better than anybody else at the time.
He could fly anything, even a barn door that had a propeller on it. He stole a magnificent executive plane. He was drunk at the time. Somebody, the mechanic, had left it standing out in front of a hangar. Idling, he took it off. They were dying on the fear end. He flew it beautifully, brought it down, staggered out of it. Said, I can fly a barn door, just put a propeller on it.
See, he was really one of the first test pilots because he had such an instinct for an airplane. We always said about Bert that he didn't get into an airplane, he put it on.
He drank, obviously, a lot, and he had a lot of gals that would come up to the hangar. But then when he would drink and do something, they would put him in jail in Mineola. The kids would get ice cream and soda and sandwiches and take them to the jail, to Bert Acosta, and they'd let us go in there.
And then, you know, he died from out in Colorado or something from alcoholism and what. But he was Bert Acosta was like God, you know.
Equally noted, the widely popular Roscoe Turner, a pilot who could do it all. The man who flew with Gilmore, his sometimes docile, sometimes not so docile lion cub.
Gilmore wanted to come back and ride in the back seat with me. I had to get after him about it. Where'd you ride him? Up in front of him?
And he had a uniform, I'll tell you. You think he flew for Haile Selassie. I mean, boy, he had pink breeches and a bright blue jacket and a blouse and a Sam Brown belt. And he was his own Air Force. But he was a good pilot, I can guarantee you that. He set a lot of transcontinental records.
Gilmore, talk to him. Talk to him.
Wonderful showman, and of course a superb pilot. Won lots of races and always had some real fancy equipment. And that great big pussycat would be right there with him.
That great big pussycat finally decided to chew on his arm. sending old Roscoe to the hospital. But that didn't hold him up for long.
He flew that GB, which everybody except, I guess, him and Jimmy Doolittle, everybody else killed themselves flying.
Oh, Roscoe was wonderful. He had been a lion tamer in his youth, and he believed firmly in self-promotion, but he deserved every bit of it. He was a wonderful pilot.
Before these daredevils and dreamers climbed into the wind from Long Island's airstrips to set their speed, endurance, and altitude records, Charles Lindbergh took the big long-distance prize. He set his sights on the skies above the Atlantic, and on that drizzly day in 1927, he trundled his Ryan, the Spirit of St. Louis, up the incline from Curtis Field to this runway at Roosevelt Field, and took off for Paris between what would later become this row of parking lot lights. He cleared that stand of trees on the far side and landed at Le Bourget Airport 33 hours and 30 minutes later. It was an astounding achievement.
And don't forget, that thing was nothing but a flying gas tank. The tank was a great big thing, and it was in front of him, so he had a periscope. He couldn't see ahead. He could look out the side. Before he did this, he was flying the airmail, you know, from Chicago to southern states. I don't know how many times he had to bail out in storms. Oh, yes. He was a thorough pilot before the Spirit of St. Louis thing.
The roster of Long Island's early flyers developed into a who's who of pioneering aviation. Motorcycle racer Glenn Curtis arrived from Hammondsport, New York, to construct his own planes and engines. Blanche Stewart, the first woman to solo, flew from Long Island, as did Harriet Quimby, the first woman in America to get a license. Lawrence Sperry went on to invent blind flight. Arctic pilot Bert Balkan, Viking of the air, who crossed the Atlantic with Bert Acosta, came to the island from Norway to hone his skills. Omer Locklear and his flying circus, the first clowns of the air. Clarence Chamberlain, Casey Jones, Commander Richard Byrd, Igor Sikorsky, Alexander D. Seversky, Leroy Grumman, Wiley Post and Harold Gaddy, who piloted the first round-the-world flight beginning and ending at Roosevelt Field. And Amelia, and a fellow who would earn the name Runway Corrigan. And, of course, Eleanor, who, before it was all over, took on a disdainful chauvinist by flying under all 4 bridges over the East River after he crashed trying to fly under just one. And then suddenly, their heyday, their eager pursuit of trophies and records and exhilaration came to an end. It was 1939. World War II erupted in Europe, and on December 7th, 1941, it engulfed us at Pearl Harbor.
You know, when the war came, we didn't have very much of anything. How the hell we ever geared up and did what we did was a miracle. But that's America.
And another name hit the headlines. Long Island's Gabby Gabreski, flying his P-47 Thunderbolt, racked up 28 victories over embattled Europe. We've since been to the moon and back. And still some wouldn't trade all of that for the days when it all began. Years after their heady exploits had ended, a few found themselves on the dais at the rededication of LaGuardia Airport. Pete Brucia remembers they were still the same bunch of hellraisers they'd always been.
There was a dinner, and they were honoring like the #1 aviation writer and magazine owner in Mexico and South America. He was a Spanish-Mexican guy. And when the elevator doors opened, you got the scanty-clad gals with the champagne up to your knees. And anyhow, Roscoe was there, and I knew Roscoe from Indiana during the war. And of course, he was like Bert Acosta. drank everything that he could see. Well, it got down to the dinner, and Bert Acosta was the master of ceremonies. And I was sitting next to him on the right side, and they were signaling, you know, to get started. And I said, come on, we got to get started. We got to get started. All right, for Christ's sake, one more drink, you know. So he stood up, and he lifted up the glass. And he said, we're here tonight to honor this son of a bitch, and I don't even know what his name is. So let's all have a drink.
I think the 20s probably, and the 30s out here were the best years. You could fly out of most any farmer's lot and land in an old cow pasture, and that is practically unheard of today. Now you've got to be at a controlled airport. And you see, we didn't have controlled airports at that time. We didn't have towers. It's a whole different ball game today.
You know, to be with Lindbergh, to be with Brosco Turner, to be with Frank Hawks, and we had Doc Walden and Elmo Pickrell and Slim Henneke, and I had the honor of being with those people, which I cherished very much.
As a boy, for me to sit with the pilots, why, that was quite a thrill. It was a dream world for me.
The old-timers still get together on Long Island to hammer and bend those magnificent flying machines back to what they once were. Each year, a crowd gathers to watch Paul Kotz and his friends crank up the old engine on his Morris Scout. Working from the original specs, Bob Fritz spends his retirement bringing Stearmans like this one back to life. The Grumman Wildcats' time may be past, but to these old flyers and mechanics, that past, the most dramatic one in all of history, isn't over just yet. There are just a handful of small fields left now. Montauk Airport on Long Island is one. Perry Duryea.
The biggest problem we have is deer on the runway at sundown. So fortunately, we live close enough to the airport, so if I'm coming in the evening, my wife goes down and runs up and down with a car and hopes to scare the deer off the runway. Unfortunately, there are so many deer in Montauk, and they're so tame that it's not at all unusual to find them still standing there looking at the airplane.
For Tom Murphy, not much stacks up to the way it all once was.
But how many people today with licenses could get in that airplane and fly a Lerone rotary engine and land that thing and keep it straight? 1 in a million? Who could get in that today, even if he was an airline captain with 20,000 hours?
Sadness just comes over me that this is only history. That there's one little statue and a little plaque there, and nothing remains of what was pretty much the cradle.
As an early flyer and now a retired 747 captain, what do you miss most?
Having the phone ring saying there's a flight, your flight departs at such and such, that's about it. And for, months after retirement, it seems strange that nothing ever happened on that telephone.
Looking back at it, I feel very fortunate. I saw Lindbergh, I saw Elmer Smith, I saw Amelia Earhart, I saw all these people around, and you didn't really know that was so exciting at the time, but it is. And as I think back, it was a very nice way to start flying.
And so those who remember fly now from farmers' fields and uncontrolled airstrips on Long Island and around the country, the more senior pilots wishing somehow they could turn back the clock. The younger ones wishing they could have been there from the beginning.
I'd like to do it all over again.